1988 Bicentennial was heralded by the publication of a number of landmark texts. But for my money, it was convict workers that did most to reset the agenda. They swept aside the tired old notion of the Dickensian criminal class and revealed the convict cargo to be no more and no less than ordinary members of the working class, caught up in a global system of forced migration. This was an immensely important recalibration. However, they also famously declared there was no convict voice, arguing it could only be recovered from the dry dust of statistics. We already know this not to be true, for we have heard their cries for death and liberty. And there is the rub, for clearly convicts are not quite so ordinary after all, for these are transported members of the working class, and they speak to us from the archives of a complex system, a paper panopticon, combining the usual bureaucratic apparatus of criminal justice, the novel bureaucratic apparatus of coerced migration, and from the further bureaucracies associated with forced labour and secondary punishment, and all were operating in the military context of a colonised land. Among the many facets of this enforced coexistence between state and convict lives are the penal stations, and they generated their own extraordinary archive. My aim today is to zoom into that archive and focus exclusively upon the humble petition, an archival artefact that is inextricably linked to the experience of secondary punishment. Indeed, these documents of dutiful deference and occasional mercy exist at the centre ground of a judicial system whose very basis was the discretionary application or mitigation of penal pain. Moreover, as Vic Gattrell suggests, these formal appeals for mercy take us closer to the private attitudes and feelings of those convicted and doomed to face death or distant exile. The process began in the jails and hulks of the British Isles with a composition of plaintive pleas to the King and Home Secretary, and it was imperfectly reflected through the colonial looking glass. Thus, endless appeals, sometimes to magistrates and masters, but more often to the governor or colonial secretary, were composed in the Sydney jail, on the Phoenix hulk, and at the penal stations themselves. Each petition begged for the bestowal of gracious pardons, merciful mitigation, or kind indulgences of every description in exchange for the exaltations and gratitude of the humble petitioner. Indeed, the vital importance of adhering to expressions of deference and humility in the ritual exchange between the powerful and the powerless has inspired a meme. The context and the continent are far removed, but the language and the authoritarian inflexibility are not. That, of course, was on the eve of the Indian Rebellion. I draw heavily upon a chapter I wrote for Chain Letters. Please forgive this retrospection, but the temptation to revisit the Port Macquarie Petitions was irresistible. They are one of the chief repositories of the Port Macquarie convict voice, both counterpoint and component of the official transcript. They tell of men and women, of innocence and guilt, of bushrangers and bush constables, of native-born lads and lasses, of separation and loss, but rarely of reward or remission. They are written with the literate fluency of a lawyer or with the unlettered simplicity of a born storyteller. Some are scratched on flimsy paper, while others are scrawled on the finest parchment.
How do I know if I'm muted?
They conjure dreams of liberty and even dreams of creation. They share the fears of informers and the skills of artisans. Most have accents heavy with the dialects of England and the Gaelic of Ireland, Wales and Scotland. While the murmuring voices of Europeans, Africans and West Indians remind us that this local story is a global story. I am not yet certain why Port Macquarie generated more petitions than Moreton Bay. Regardless, my filing cabinet is the crowded testament to that fact. And my first contribution to our database legacy project will be to digitise that drawer. When I first met Clive at the museum, he asked me about the Port Macquarie pioneers. those men who came on the so-called First Fleet in 1821, the subject of Rex's poem. For despite the wonders of the archive, there is no list of those convicts who established the foundations of the settlement. All we know for sure is that the convict pioneers had been especially selected, and among them were 3 good carpenters, 2 sawyers, 1 blacksmith, 1 tailor, 2 shoemakers, a medical assistant, and 50 strong labourers from the Sydney gangs. Curiously, there is no mention of the commandant's clerk. Later in August, a good house carpenter was sent along with brickmakers and a layer to complete what was quite literally the foundational workforce. Again, no one is named. Posterity has always been the preserve of those with status and authority. The convict volunteers lacked both, nor were they under sentence, so recording their transfer to Port Macquarie in the indents or police histories was neither relevant nor necessary. Moreover, most were returned to headquarters once the convicts who were under sentence of secondary transportation started arriving from Sydney and Newcastle in 1822. Regrettably, there is no drum roll. It's more of a light tap. For today, I bring you not a list, but a single name. My records reveal that among those volunteers was a convict carpenter named West Evans, and this short but carefully constructed position, he recounts his micro-history. Perhaps some of you already know his name, but his petition and the sad story it tells is worthy of our further attention. We learn he came by the Neptune, and we can therefore infer he arrived in the colony in 1817. Unlike most petitioners, Evans does not linger on the details of his original conviction, perhaps deeming it by then an irrelevant measure of his status, for in 1821, West Evans had been awarded a ticket of leave. As a carpenter, he was a relative aristocrat of convict labour. The value of his skill afforded privileges and opportunities that had set him apart from the unskilled gangs. Having attained his ticket, he lived out of barracks and could work on his own account. His freedom and future in Sydney must have looked secure. That is, until May 1826, when the lodgings he shared on Kent Street were robbed of various items, including his ticket. It is thanks to these unfortunate circumstances that West paid for a prayerful pen to be put to expensive paper in May 1826, so that we, in April 2021, may learn that at the time of the first formation of Port Macquarie Petition volunteered his services to the settlement to obtain his ticket of leave from the then Governor, General Macquarie. That in the year 1821, Petitioner obtained a ticket of leave consequent on the services aforesaid. It is only fitting that today, of all days, we should meet one of those elusive volunteers. His petition, though, does a good deal more than rise to our bicentennial occasion, for it is a model of its type, demonstrating the brevity and perspicuity that, according to a gentleman of acknowledged literary talent, were the desired characteristics of the humble petition. Advertising in the Monitor in 1828, the literary gentleman offered his services to the public in the preparation of all public and private correspondence, and advised a careful avoidance of obscurity and prolixity if an appeal was not to be deemed frivolous and troublesome to the authorities. The scribe who wrote the petition on behalf of the demonstrably illiterate West Evans could not be accused of obscurity or prolixity. Indeed, from our perspective, it is frustrating in its brevity, but for the purposes of appeal, it was perfectly presented, adhering to the conventions of deference and duty while remaining clear and concise. Thus, when he submitted the hardships of his case to the favourable consideration of His Excellency, trusting His Excellency would grant petitioner an order for the return of that indulgence he had so assiduously earned and so unhappily lost, West Evans may well have been reasonably confident of success. Alas, I do not call this the draw of doom for nothing. West Evans was appealing to the humanity and mercy of Governor Ralph Darling, and his prayer will not be answered. Governor Darling's biographer describes him as a governor maligned, to which I am tempted to add the subtitle, not nearly enough. As if trapped in a desperate game of convict snakes and ladders, our doughty pioneers slipped down the ranks to the status of ordinary convict service. It would be 1831 before West Evans could climb that ladder and regain that ticket he had so assiduously earned and so unhappily lost. As a novelist, Meg would be able to fill the emotional gaps in this story. She would likely describe West's despair and his attempts to assuage it in the rough pubs of George Street. But for the historian, his unrecorded pain is lost to the historical moment. However, without the restraining hand of a literary gentleman, the emotional impact of such a reversal of fortune can almost erupt from the page. Which brings me to the querulous fears of George Mollison. Dear Sir, I am this day warned for my destination. I believe for Port Macquarie, very badly prepared. My concern lies at a great distance and bad roads. By what at a great part? I am ordered, I must obey. I am willing to meet my fate, whatever happens. Forgive me, Scotland. As a veteran of the Second Fleet and long since comfortably settled in life, George Mollison had been confident of his character and secure in his well-earned freedom. That is, until 1822, when he was sentenced to 14 years heavy labour for harbouring bushrangers on his lonely Hawkesbury farm. The extraordinarily harsh sentence was a direct result of those heightened anxieties provoked by the outbreak of bushranging in the 1820s. And this is the key point about petitions. They invariably recount the human impact of wider events and wider policies. For an old man, even an old sailor, who had twice crossed the oceans to Australia, first as a convict and then as a free man, the journey to his place of exile in Port Macquarie was truly daunting. I am doomed, he wrote. Indeed, the long vows of his doom are echoed again and again when he writes, where I am to go, where I will do, 17 days ago. Here the poignancy is heightened as oral and literary cultures collide to reveal the sound of an exile's lament. George Mollison's uneven, ill-formed script barely disguises his plaintive wail, while his awkward spelling and syntax reveal the structure and sound of his own Edinburgh accent. The sheer effort of written articulation is evident in every word. This is the convict voice, and it is almost unutterably sad. George Mollison would never return to his fine Hawkesbury farm with its 40 hogs and 50 fruitful acres. He died a pauper's death here in Port Macquarie in 1836, just 2 years shy of that sentence of 15 heavy. Emotion also pours from an angry letter sent by Sophia Freya to her husband in Port Macquarie. In May 1825, she had married James Henshaw shortly before he was transported, promising to join him as soon as permission was granted. But with sudden cold feet, Sophia skipped town. She was found at her husband's behest and placed in the female factory. There she waited, uncertain, uninformed, and unfree. This letter, in her own handwriting, was intercepted by the commandant and enclosed with her husband's petition. Such letters between convicts, complete with poor grammar, instinctive spelling, are a rare and moving glimpse of the uncensored thoughts and feelings of lives caught in conflict and chaos. My dear husband, with a sorrowful heart, I once more write to you in the hopes that these few lines will find you in good health, as it find me at present. My long confinement in this miserably place ought, I think, move you to pity and compassion to write to me. I would never have married you if I had not a sincere regard for you, but I'm sorry to say that my marriage at present is very fatal to me. It is the last time I shall ever trouble you with writing any more. If I do not hear from you, I shall endeavour to go out to a place of service, as I am, thank God, quite capable of earning. She was from Whitechapel. Again, I apologise. Sophia appears forthright and confident of her ability, but she is also resentful of her lot, and her sense of abandonment is palpable. However, this letter illumines more than the emotional strain of her own predicament, for it exposes the peculiar vulnerability shared by the convict wives left behind, demonstrating the ways in which their husbands colluded with the authorities to contain their mobility and control their conduct. Joseph Hines, for example, suspected his wife Catherine of entering into prostitution following his sentence to Port Macquarie, and wrote from the Phoenix Hulk, begging His Majesty's Colonial Secretary grant an order for the apprehension and lodgement of his said wife in the female recess at Parramatta. And there are scores more. Meanwhile, as Sophia fretted in that miserably place, James was doing his best to bring her to him. I have frequently addressed His Excellency upon the subject, he told the Commandant, but being at the sugar plantation, I am fearful that those with whom I entrusted the delivery of my petitions have failed. They hadn't. The following month, they both received identical letters of non-compliance. Sophia's forthright character, so vividly and disastrously exposed in that resentful letter, was deemed undeserving of such kind indulgence. However, James's prayer was persistent and persuasive, for Sophia was transferred to Port Macquarie in 1827, and there she remained until at least 1830. Whether she was any less resentful in what was, after all, just another miserably place is not recorded. The eventual success of their appeal was by no means typical. Terse tales of official refusal appear in the scribbled minutes of almost every petition, usually, but not invariably, in the distinctive flat black hand of Governor Ralph Darling. Undeserving of indulgence, cannot be granted, cannot be allowed, cannot be complied with, and worst of all, no answer. The cringing and needful tones of dutiful deference were sometimes hard to sustain in the face of such an indifferent silence, a silence that was all too familiar to the overseers and skilled men of Port Macquarie. Overseer Thomas Crawl maintained order and output at the agricultural establishment with an efficiency and dedication the superintendent, William Parker, entirely lacked. Conscious of his worth and confident of his entitlement, by 1828, Crawl was allowing his impatience to show. The petitioner, not having received an answer to his many applications and agreeable to the colonial regulations, considering himself entitled to a ticket of leave, most humbly begs, etc., etc. In this case, the scrawled minutes are more helpful than usual, posing the revealing question, how can a prisoner at Port Macquarie claim a ticket of leave? This was an expression of rhetorical surprise. How can they? How dare they? Thomas Crawl, Joseph McManus, overseer of the Cedar Party, Andrew Ferguson, principal overseer of the Stockyard, Constable Patrick Cox, and overseer Thomas Atkin were among those upon whom it gradually dawned their dutiful service did not guarantee reward or admission on a penal station. Similarly, Jacob Bull, stonemason, and author of that first exquisitely crafted petition. Thomas Mann, a useful blacksmith and a useful voice in Reverend Cross's choir. Ben Taylor, the bullock driver. James Williams, the former slave and pioneer of sugar production in Australia. And James Hawkins, the free boat builder, would all learn that useful skills and faithful service would not deliver the indulgence held out by His Excellency for well-conducted men. In the event, Crawl's appeal was rendered irrelevant by the extraordinary circumstances of his apparent death. On the 17th of November that same year, Crawl headed for the mountains to get a few rifle birds for the new commandant. He was a trusted man. He was never seen alive again. The subsequent discovery of his gun and skeletal human remains rather precludes, but does not exclude, the possibility that he had resorted to other arrangements for his liberty. It was poor Commandant Rolland, in his last dispatch to Governor Brisbane in 1824, who sounded this prescient warning. Punishments, in whatever variety inflicted, will, I fear, prove insufficient when the hope of reward, that strongest stimulus to human exertion, is removed, anticipating almost perfectly the words of this elegant petition framed by a class of prisoners convicted by the magistracy, that's a tricky one, for life. Reformation upon a principle of honour, of philosophy, or even of real religion will never actuate the exile while hope is deferred, and that primary stimulus to personal exertion, the certainty of reward, is withheld. These men had been sentenced, illegally as it turns out, by a magistrate, mainly for breaking convict regulations or offending their master, but above all, for life. As David has recently shown, many of the hundreds of convicts caught in this legal predicament were more likely to run, which in turn landed many of them at Macquarie Harbour. So perhaps it is no wonder that these cautious lifers invested their hopes in the humble petition. In fact, the letter of a new law and the determination of a new Attorney General to apply it in the face of an obdurate magistracy would eventually bring reprieve, though not immediately and not for everyone. Alas, my time is nearly served, and I now come full circle by returning to the First Fleet. The entrances to the barred rivers of the East Coast are littered with wrecks, and in April 1821, the First Fleet only narrowly avoided a similar fate. In 1826, the constant danger posed by the shifting sands of the bar and the boredom of signal duty prompted an enterprising young private named William Baines to petition the Colonial Secretary with his innovative scheme of light boats, rockets launched, lives saved, and he had fervently hoped a grateful governor. The son of a Kentish lightship keeper, William had been raised within sight of the treacherous Goodwin Sands, and he knew the particular perils of sea over sand. This wonderful moment of vivid and inventive colour, buried deep in the penal station archive, was no match for the terse black and white of a memo of rejection. But one afternoon, long ago, in the archives on George Street, it gave this grateful historian a moment of reprieve from the monochrome world of the humble petition and its fragile lives and its fragile hopes.
Four minutes for questions while we're getting Meg Keneally up online. Anybody want to ask a question of Tamsin?
Can I ask it of myself? I made that thing, I got a bonus convict, and there he is, William Judd, and I was joking, you know, the bonus steak knives. It was that wait, there's more joke, you know, that only Australians will get. So in fact, there's even more. There's another slide, because David has already done quite a lot of work on the list of volunteers. And he didn't have West Evans, but he did have William Judd. And Clive is completing this work with a forthcoming book, I believe.
Indeed.
Yes, so that's exciting.
I was delighted to see you use those photos of pictures of Richards.
Yes, I was thrilled by that. Yes, I saw that.
We're delighted to have these pictures here that Richard has painted. There's an exhibition in Port Macquarie featuring these and several more, I believe, Richard. Yes, thank you, Tam.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
I just wondered whether Macquarie's demise, I think, was about 1821, where he was sent back because he was too helpful to the emancipists and the Bent brothers, and the report into his way of dealing with convicts and giving them hope was reported back in England, and the Secretary had actually advised Darling to be much harsher and therefore give them no hope. Is that?
I think that's a very good summary. This thing happens that sort of at the same time as the founding of Port Macquarie, which is called the Big Report, which was a review of the convict system and a sort of set of new protocols developed. And it's about putting terror back into the system. So Port Macquarie was also partly Macquarie's idea, but then Big's influence shaped how it would be. The real prototype of the Big Report, though, in my belief, is Morecambe Bay, because that's where they really enact the recommendations. And of course, then there's Norfolk Island as well, and there's another network on Van Diemen's Land. So things do get much worse when Macquarie leaves. There's a new regime, and of course, Darling, I'm joking about the governing aligned, but it's hard not to feel furious with him at times. But he is doing what he was put there to do. They wanted that approach.
Tamsin, thank you
It's a pleasure.
very, very much.